Highlands Presbyterian, happy Reformation Sunday. It is October 31st, and our text for today is from Genesis, chapter 8, starting in verse 1. And so this is picking up right in the middle of the story about Noah. And so Noah is out floating on the flood, in the ark, all the animals, Noah's family. Picking up, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the seventh month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the earth. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, question for you. How long do you wait for someone before giving up and leaving? It's a very different question than it was 30 years ago. Right now, you can text someone to see if they're coming, or you could use your phone to call them to see if they are on their way, right? It's amazing. It occurs to me how rarely I sometimes use my phone to actually make calls, right? At some point we changed the name of it from a phone, right? So earlier this year, Jerry and Cheryl had organized a hike at Highbanks for the church. And I went, but I had left my phone at home. And when I got to Highbanks, half the parking lots were full. And so I didn't know where to meet up. And finally found a parking spot and just set out on the trail, and happened to be lucky enough to run into them, and so joined the group for the hike. And when I got home, I saw that I had a bunch of mixed text messages and mixed calls. But by and large, not having my phone meant that we just eventually had to go out on our own. Right? Because when you're uncertain, it can be hard to make decisions about how long you wait, right? There's a process you go through where the first thing is you wonder, right? Did I get the time and the place right? We doubt ourselves. Then after a few minutes, we begin to doubt the other person. We wonder if they made a mistake. And then we wonder if they've given up on us or if they're reliable, right? We start asking all these questions and we go down the rabbit hole and we start to make assumptions about the other person. There's a psychological study I read about some years back where it said when we make mistakes, we tend to attribute it to external factors. But when other people make mistakes, we tend to attribute it to internal factors where we'd say, hey, I run into traffic when I'm late, but when they're late, it's because they're maybe not reliable. They're the type of person who is considerate of others. And so we get tired of waiting for the other person. We take things into our own hands and we act, right? We maybe just leave. If you're waiting at a movie theater, you just go into the movie and say, I don't know if they're going to show up or not. There's a famous story in the Bible about this. And in 1 Kings, I promise I'll get to the one about Noah. But in 1 Samuel, King Saul is leading his troops into battle. And Samuel, the prophet, who's standing in for God, tells Saul to wait 7 days. And then Saul will show up and make the proper offerings. And so Samuel will show up and make the proper offerings. And so he says to wait 7 days. Well, around the 7th day, Saul notices that the people in his army are starting to get nervous, and some of them are starting to leave. And so Saul isn't sure that Samuel is dependable. He's not sure Samuel's going to come through. And so Saul's getting nervous that he's going to lose the moment, that he's going to miss out on the future, on the opportunity. And so Saul takes things into his own hands, and Saul makes the offerings, which is a big no-no. And then you can see what's going on, right? Just as Saul is finishing up, Samuel shows up. and sees what Saul has done, how Saul didn't wait on Samuel, which means that Saul essentially didn't wait on God, and Saul acted on his own. And so Samuel is furious, and he tells Saul that God was ready to establish Saul's kingdom forever, but now Saul is going to lose that privilege because Saul didn't trust that God would act faithfully as God had promised. Saul didn't trust God's provision. It's not really that different than what happens in the garden at the beginning of Genesis, right? When Adam and Eve are there, and God has given them all these good things to eat, and God has provided for their every need, and yet they're staring at the tree that they can't eat from, and they're saying, can we really trust God? And rather than trust what God has given us, we're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to take from this tree that God told us not to. Because do we really trust God? Do we trust that God will faithfully provide for us no matter what? And just like Adam and Eve said, hey, we're gonna lean on our own understanding, Saul does the same thing. He says, I'm going to act because I'm not sure I can trust God. And so Saul does what he wants, and he suffers this huge consequence, right? It is very challenging to wait, right? Because when you're waiting, you're dependent on someone else. Things are not necessarily in your control, and it can make you very nervous, right? It requires a huge amount of trust in the party upon whom you wait. Going back to our earlier conversation, think about how long you'd be willing to wait on someone for dinner, right? How long would you wait for a total stranger? What about a casual acquaintance? What about a close friend? What about a spouse? That should be the longest one. Right? As the relationship deepens, as the trust increases, you're likely willing to wait longer because you trust that that person is going to show up. So Saul, in this case, was not willing to wait on God because he didn't have the trust that he needed. And this lack of trust cost him over the long run. In the short run, he was able to make the offering. And so maybe some of the people from his army were able to stick around. So he got this short-term thing that he wanted, but he lost out long-term. Someone once said that the Israelites, when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, and that God was teaching them one lesson over and over again for the entire 40 years, to trust and depend on God, right? The manna from heavens that came down 6 days of the week, right? That God was teaching the Israelites to depend on God, that God would be faithful to the promise to provide for them, that God was teaching them this over and over again. It took 40 years for them to learn this lesson. Right? The Israelites had a hard time. As soon as they had left slavery in Egypt, they were looking back and saying, oh, remember we had food to eat there. And they were thinking they were wanted to go back. And God would say, no, we need to go forward. You have to trust me that what is ahead of you is better. And that because I have promised it, that it will be provided for you. And it was a hard thing for the Israelites to learn that trust. Even when they got to the border and they sent the spies into the promised land, the spies came back with these reports about the people that lived in the land. The Israelites were afraid. They had a hard time trusting God, and Caleb and Joshua were trying to convince them to go forward into the promised land, to rely on the promises of God. And so we come to Noah. I told you I'd get here eventually, right? Many people learned as children that Noah, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and Noah was on the ark. But when you read it, you realize that Noah was on the ark much longer than that. Right? First, they enter the ark for 7 days before the rains even come. Think about that. For 7 days, they're sitting there in the ark, wondering if they've made the right choice, wondering if it was the right decision to enter the ark. It hasn't started raining yet. And so for 7 days, they're likely second-guessing themselves. Did we put our trust in the right promise maker? Or should we act on our own? Should we strike out and try to secure a future for ourselves? Or do we depend on God? Right? But then the rains come and they discover, hey, we placed our trust in the right place. It was right to trust in God. God is faithful to God's promises. And then it rains for 40 days, but anybody who's ever had a flood in the basement knows that when the floods build up, right, the water comes in a lot more quickly than it goes out. Right? It sits, and it takes a long time for that water to go out. And then speaking from personal and traumatic experience there. Right? And so in this case, Noah is in the ark for about 370 days. Right? So a full year, essentially. Right? So after 40 days of rain, there's waters covering the entire earth. And then it stops raining. The ark floats on for another 150 days after that. And it finally comes to rest on Mount Ararat. And then the waters keep receding. And they keep receding. But there's a lot of water, right? And so the entire time Noah is stuck in the ark with his family and 2 of every kind of animal. And he starts sending out these birds for reconnaissance. And for a while they find nothing. And so they're waiting in the ark. Right? So the ark is a home, but it must have seen those walls must have been closing in after all this time. And I'm sure they're eager to burst out, but they have to trust that God is going to provide for them. The same God who provided for them through the storm, who brought them to the mountain. They have to trust that the plan is going to go forward as God promised that it would. And right, friends, our situation is not so different from Noah's story, right? The old saying is that we're not all in the same boat, but we are all in the same storm. Right? Each and every one of us is facing something difficult. Or maybe we know that something difficult is coming. Right? Maybe you're like Noah and his family before the storm, right? And trusting God to lead you through the storm, you're sitting in the boat and you're wondering if you've made the right decision. By placing your trust in God, will God lead you through this coming storm? Do I place my trust in God, or do I try to secure my own future? Do I save up for myself, right? We're thinking about this in terms of stewardship. And so we think about our resources. Are we willing to give resources to hand them over to God and to trust that God will lead this through? Or do we hold on to our resources thinking that we are better able to secure a future for ourselves? In whom do we place our trust in the midst of the storm? Right? Some of you are in the storm now. You've been in the storm for days, for weeks, for months, maybe for years, right? The boat is rocking and you're wondering, is this sufficient? Have I put my trust in the right place, right? And the waves are coming, the storm, the winds are blowing. And you're wondering, are you going to make it through? Have you made the right choice? Like Saul, you're looking around and you're seeing reasons to be fearful. And you're wondering, do I need to act differently? Right? To continue to wait on God can be challenging. Right? This is a God who spent 40 years teaching the Israelites how to depend on God. What if it takes us 40 years to learn the next lesson that God is trying to teach us? Right? But the good news is, right, in Genesis Chapter 8, verse 1, it says, God remembers Noah, right? Just like God remembers us. And in the midst of the ark comes to rest on a mountain. And the same is true of us, right? In the storm, and we may be stuck in the midst of the storm for months, maybe for years. But there is a mountain. And the ark comes to rest on the mountain. Our lives rest on the mountain. Right? No matter how thick the storm, no matter how strong the storm, when God makes a promise to deliver us, God keeps that promise. Right? Though the waters may rise, there is an anchor, there is a mountain in the midst of the storm. And then as the story of Noah goes forth, eventually they go out in the ark and there is life and they repopulate the earth. And the same is true of us, right? We come to rest on the mountain and there is life ahead of us, no matter what trial we've gone through. And what Jesus shows us, right, is even the trial of death, there is life ahead of us. And he has to wait in the tomb, right? But he trusts in the future. And because of that, life goes forth out of the tomb, right? There is a mountain in the stormy seas that we traverse, and we will come to rest on the mountain. And so we can place our resources in God's hands because we know that God is faithful to God's promises. And we come to rest on a mountain, right? There's that image the prophets use throughout Scripture where they talk about the mountain sort of as the kingdom of God. And it's the same image that C.S. Lewis borrows at the end of the Narnia trilogies where they're going higher and higher and deeper, and it gets better and better, right? There's the mountain, the kingdom of God, where people come from north and south and east and west to feast on the mountain. We will rest on that mountain, just as Noah comes out of the storm and lives on the mountain, right? The ark rests on the mountain. So too, we come through the storm and we will rest on the mountain. And so therefore, we can place our trust, we can place our lives, we can place our resources, our gifts in God's hands, because God is faithful to God's promises. And I want to close with a quote from John Calvin's commentary on Genesis 8, because I think he captures so well God's care for us. Let us therefore learn by this example to repose on the providence of God, even while he seems to be most forgetful of us. For at length, by affording us help, he will testify that he has been mindful of us. What? If the flesh persuade us to distrust, let us not yield to its restlessness. But as soon as this thought creeps in, that God has cast off all care concerning us, or is asleep, or far distant, let us immediately meet it with this shield. The Lord, who has promised his help to the miserable, will, in due time, be present with us, that we may indeed perceive the care he takes of us. Nor is there less weight in what is added, that God also remembered the animals. For if, on account of the salvation promised to man, his favor is extended to brute cattle and to wild beasts, what may we suppose will be his favor toward his own children, to whom he has so liberally and so sacredly pledged his faithfulness? Friends, God has pledged his faithfulness to you. And God keeps the promises that God makes. Thanks be to God.